There is a place sitting in the northwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, inside the borders of present-day Saudi Arabia, where enormous rose-red tombs have been carved directly into sandstone mountains by human hands, where ancient inscriptions cover cliff faces in a script that predates Arabic, where wells dug thousands of years ago still hold water to this day, and where the remains of one of the most sophisticated civilizations that ever existed on Arabian soil have been sitting in the open desert, largely undisturbed, for over 2,000 years. The place is called Mada'in Salih, and in the Quran, Allah uses it as one of the most direct, geographically specific, and archaeologically verifiable warnings ever delivered to the human race, pointing to a destroyed civilization and saying to every person who passes it, "Look at what happened here, understand why it happened, and take the lesson seriously before you repeat it." And yet, as Saudi Arabia accelerates the development of this site under Vision 2030 and positions it as a global UNESCO tourism destination, two waves of content have been flooding Muslim social media simultaneously. One group claiming that the Quran's account of the Thamud is ancient mythology that modern archaeology has quietly disproved, and another group claiming the site is so divinely cursed that any Muslim who visits it is committing a religious transgression. And both of these positions are wrong. Both of them are spreading without scholarly correction, and both of them deserve a direct, evidence-based, composed response today. The Thamud are not a people invented by the Quran, and this single fact dismantles the foundational premise of the skeptical argument before it even develops, because the name Thamud appears in sources that predate the revelation of the Quran by over 1,000 years, and were produced by civilizations that had no connection to Arabia's religious traditions whatsoever. Assyrian royal inscriptions from the 8th century BCE, under King Sargon II, record military encounters with a people identified by the same name in the same geographical region. Ancient Greek geographical texts, including the writings of Diodorus Siculus and the works of Ptolemy, reference the Thamud as a known Arabian people. Roman military records document a Thamudic auxiliary unit serving within the Roman imperial army. And across thousands of rock surfaces throughout the Hijaz, the Sinai, and northwestern Arabia, archaeologists have catalogued what are classified as Thamudic inscriptions, texts written in a distinct South Semitic alphabet older than Nabatean Arabic, containing personal names, tribal identifiers, votive dedications, and territorial markings, whose geographic distribution alone traces the settlement range and movement patterns of the Thamudic people across several centuries of continuous habitation, in precisely the region the Quran identifies. These inscriptions do not merely confirm that a people called Thamud existed. They map where those people lived, how they organized themselves tribally, and what landscape they considered home. And that landscape corresponds directly to the Al-Hijr region where Mada'in Salih sits today. This is not a single source that a skeptic can dismiss as derivative. This is a convergence of Assyrian, Greek, Roman, Nabatean, and epigraphic documentation across more than a millennium of independent historical record, produced by people with no theological stake in validating anything the Quran would later say. And that level of multi-source external corroboration is precisely what historians consider among the strongest forms of evidence available for the existence of any ancient people. The Quran mentions the Thamud in no fewer than 26 locations across multiple surahs, and the account is internally consistent, geographically specific, and contains details that carry genuine historical weight when examined against the evidence, which is the examination that those who call it mythology have consistently failed to actually perform. In Surah Al-Hijr, and it is not a coincidence that this surah carries the name Al-Hijr, the ancient designation for the very region where Mada'in Salih is located. Verse 82 states with complete directness, "They used to carve out houses from the mountains, feeling secure." This is not metaphor. It is a description of a specific architectural practice in a specific geographical landscape. And the evidence of rock-carved structures in the Hijaz is visible in the archaeological record, and has been documented extensively by researchers who have no Islamic agenda driving their findings. The narrative the Quran presents is structured around a consistent set of elements: a prosperous, architecturally sophisticated civilization in the Al-Hijr region, a prophet named Salih sent from among their own people, a she-camel designated as a divine sign and a test of their obedience, a collective decision to slaughter the camel in open defiance, and then a sudden, overwhelming destruction. Now, here is something that most Islamic content on this topic overlooks entirely, and it is worth paying close attention because it reveals a dimension of Quranic precision that the skeptics never honestly engage with. The Quran does not use a single word to describe the punishment of the Thamud. Across different surahs, Allah uses 4 distinct Arabic terms: Rajfa in Surah Al-A'raf, a violent trembling or seismic convulsion of the earth; Sayha in Surah Hud and Surah Al-Hijr, a thunderous, overwhelming blast or cry that strikes from the air; Sa'ika in Surah Al-Dhariyat, a devastating bolt of annihilating force; and Taghiya in Surah Al-Haqqa, an exceeding, transgressing force that surpasses all normal boundaries of destruction. A surface reader looks at 4 different words describing what appears to be one event and calls it inconsistency. And this is precisely the objection that critics raise. But the scholars of tafsir, and in particular Imam Ibn Ashur in his monumental work Al-Tahrir wa Al-Tanwir, explain that these terms are not contradicting one another, but describing different dimensions of a single catastrophic event from different angles. The seismic convulsion of the ground, the devastating aerial blast, the bolt-like strike of the punishment, and the exceeding boundary-breaking nature of its total force. In the same way that a modern disaster report might describe one earthquake using terms like ground rupture, pressure wave, structural collapse, and seismic magnitude, without any of those descriptions contradicting the others. The Quran's use of 4 precise terms is not a sign of inconsistency. It is a sign of a descriptive precision that a single word could never capture, and the fact that each term appears in the surah that contextually calls for it is itself a mark of the literary and theological coherence of the Quranic text. The skeptical argument currently circulating takes 2 primary forms, and both of them fail under basic scrutiny. Not because we are applying a defensive framework to protect the Quran from examination, but because the arguments contain logical errors identifiable entirely on their own terms. The first claim is that the Quran borrowed the Thamud narrative from pre-Islamic Arabian folklore, making it mythology rather than history. And this argument requires the person making it to simultaneously dismiss the Assyrian inscriptions, the Greek texts, the Roman records, the Nabatean archaeology, and the thousands of Thamudic rock inscriptions mapping tribal settlement across the Hijaz, all of which are non-Islamic sources produced by non-Muslim civilizations. And when a skeptical argument requires you to discard that volume of independent, multi-civilizational evidence to maintain your conclusion, the argument is no longer functioning as skepticism. It is functioning as the very thing it claims to oppose. The second claim is that because the famous carved monuments at Mada'in Salih are Nabatean rather than Thamudic, the Quranic account is archaeologically undermined, and this argument contains a category error so fundamental that it is difficult to understand how it has spread as widely as it has, because the Quran does not claim that the Nabatean tombs were built by the Thamud. The Quran describes the Thamud as a people who carved into the mountains of the Al-Hijr region, and the archaeological and epigraphic evidence confirms Thamudic habitation in that exact landscape. The fact that the Nabateans later built their own monumental architecture in the same geographically significant region is simply the ordinary pattern of multiple civilizations occupying a strategically valuable landscape across successive centuries, which is one of the most well-documented phenomena in all of human settlement history and requires no special explanation. The intellectually honest position, the position the full weight of available evidence actually supports, is that Mada'in Salih is a site of genuine multi-layered historical significance, whose connection to the civilization the Quran describes is confirmed, rather than challenged by serious archaeology. And if you have been encountering the skeptical version of this argument without the tools to respond clearly, that is precisely the kind of gap this channel was built to close. The question of whether it is permissible for a Muslim to visit Mada'in Salih has been circulating in Muslim communities for decades and has intensified sharply as the site becomes a high-profile international destination. And it requires a direct answer grounded in the actual texts rather than the cultural anxiety that has accumulated around the topic without scholarly foundation. The hadith that generates the concern is authentic and recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari. It describes the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passing through the Al-Hijr area during the Tabuk expedition in the 9th year of Hijra, instructing his companions not to enter the dwellings of the punished people except while weeping, saying, "Do not enter upon these people who were punished unless you are weeping, lest what befell them should befall you," and then covering his face and quickening his pace through the area. Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in Fath al-Bari, the most authoritative classical commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari ever produced, explains this hadith as establishing a specific etiquette of humility and reflection when passing through sites of divine punishment, not as a categorical legal prohibition on entering the area for the purposes of study, research, or contemplative visitation. And this is not a modern convenience invented to accommodate tourism. It is the classical scholarly reading, produced centuries before Saudi Vision 2030 existed. The Quran itself, in Surah Al-Naml, verse 69, commands directly, "Say, travel through the land and observe how was the end of the criminals." And this is a universal instruction to the believing community to engage with the physical evidence of divine history in the landscape, to look at what happened, and to understand what it means. Which means that the Muslim who visits Mada'in Salih with awareness, humility, and the intention of increasing their fear of Allah is not violating the Sunnah of the Prophet. They are fulfilling the explicit invitation of the Quran. there is a dimension of the Thamud's account that is almost always reduced to background detail, and it is actually the most theologically significant element of the entire narrative, and that is the fact that their transgression was not an act of ignorance. The Quran is explicit that the Thamud received a prophet from among their own people, who spoke their language, who knew their society, who delivered a message they understood completely, and who presented them with a visible, physical, tangible sign as a direct test of their willingness to submit to a single clearly communicated boundary. And then, in Surah Al-Qamar, verse 29, Allah describes what happened next with 4 words that carry enormous theological weight. فَنَدُوا صَحِيبَهُمْ فَتَعَتَى. They called to their companion, and he responded and acted. This was a collective decision, a coordinated choice made by a people who knew precisely what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. Not out of confusion, not out of ignorance, but out of the specific arrogance that a civilization develops when its material achievements lead it to believe that the rules applying to less accomplished peoples do not apply to them. And the punishment that followed was not disproportionate to a single act. It was the consequence of a collective moral position that had been building long before the camel was ever harmed, a position in which a civilization looked at what it had built and concluded that its sophistication had placed it beyond accountability. This is why the Quran returns to the Thamud 26 times, not to repeat a story, but to repeat a warning about a pattern of civilizational behavior that has no expiration date, that is not limited to ancient Arabia, and that reappears in every generation of human society, that confuses what it has built with immunity from what it owes. The Thamud of Mada'in Salih are not mythology. They are a historically documented, externally corroborated, archaeologically attested people described in the Quran with a geographical and descriptive precision that increases in credibility the more carefully it is examined against the full weight of available evidence, rather than evaluated against a selective reading designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. The skeptic who points to Nabatean tombs as a refutation of the Quranic account has made a category error that dissolves the moment the argument is read carefully. The Muslim who treats the hadith of Al-Hijr as a blanket prohibition has taken a text about humility and stripped it of the very purpose for which it was given. And the believer who reduces the story of the Thamud to a narrative about a camel has missed the most urgent dimension of what Allah is communicating. That collective arrogance, built on material sophistication and sustained by the refusal to submit to a clearly communicated boundary, is not a historical curiosity. It is a permanent description of a human tendency that the Quran is warning every subsequent civilization about, with permanent, geographically anchored, still standing evidence. The Quran does not point to Mada'in Salih because Allah wants Muslims to fear a desert. The Quran points to it because the mountains remember what the people forgot.